it. Okay, so blob maps. More or less, how do we organize and interpret space? Have you ever wondered why you feel attracted or comfortable in specific places? Or if other people feel the same way about that place as you do? So my thesis, it explores alternative methods to spatial communication and the possible applications across various disciplines. So currently, space is communicated to us in the form of maps, GPS location, signage, wayfinding systems, and we really don't have to think about space. These systems just do it for us. And this thesis began as a wayfinding system design project. So began in this headspace, but after an interesting conversation with the professor, he challenged me to reconsider how we approach traditional mapping systems. So the concept of blob maps was born from an attempt to more deeply understand our ambiguous or illogical organization of space and how that affects how we use and move in a place. Blob maps are an abstract interpretation of a place, such as a city made by participants with clay forms. And blob maps are how we see and remember a place in our minds versus traditional maps communicating that place to you. They're a shift in understanding space from a cognitive point of view to behavioral. And thinking about the history of designing space, it's kind of eerie to think about how trusting we are of maps. Someone designed them and they are not and have not always been 100% correct. In fact, they are sometimes distorted on purpose to simplify information, which is often needed. Looking at Google Maps, satellite view is much more confusing to understand than a simplified graphic map. But nonetheless, it's a huge responsibility for designers that communicate spatial information. So what is it specifically about traditional mapping that I discovered to be problematic? While simplification is important in presenting digestible information, it can also lead to extremes. Icons are helpful and needed in many situations, but at what point are they blocking individual interpretation? So a simple house icon doesn't properly represent the physical facade of most buildings in the world. So do these pragmatic icons have an effect on the organic movement within an urban environment? And then technology, it's ingrained in our navigational habits. Gone are the days of keeping an atlas in your car or printing out MapQuest directions. We're literally a blue dot on a screen that moves along a smartphone directed path. Google, for example, tailors directions and alters the spatial flow within a city based on our smartphone locations. So a group of smartphones on a highway equals a traffic jam, according to Google, and those arriving will be rerouted. And maps are visual traditionally. There are some auditory and tactile options for hearing and visually impaired now, but for the most part, we read and see maps. But in real life, real-time navigation, we're experiencing the city with every possible sense. The smells, touch, taste, sounds, emotions, everything is embedded in our memories. And when we reflect on a memory, we know exactly where that memory took place, and that's our behavioral map. Finally, confining borders, zoning, similar to an overuse in iconography, is very restrictive. Understanding physical space only within the confines of a designated area is going to influence where you move in that space. So, what are the byproducts of these issues? Socially, we are disconnected when we experience a city. There's different groups of people experiencing conflicting social interactions, such as tourists versus locals. And this encourages this division of where people go in a city and how they use it, how they move. Additionally, social media, review sites, travel blogs, media just in general, all influence our perception of a place, even without us being aware of it, even before we arrive in that place. So after the book Eat, Pray, Love was adapted to a movie, there was a 164% increase in what's called Enlightenment Tourism. It's huge impact. And then, after analyzing the history and the implications of traditional mapping, I needed to explore how we personally use space and understand space for ages, we've applied meaning to physical to make sense of it, to understand what it might be, just to kind of apply meaning, what we today might consider myths or legends. And then we also orient ourselves in space. We are consciously aware of our body in relation to the environment and to other people and objects. And then following orientation, we're able to navigate to get from point A to point B. Navigation involves processing sensory information. So this is the very nitty-gritty of how we get from point A to point B. The cerebral cortex is all that information that's coming in when you're experiencing a place, and then you make navigational decisions in the hippocampus. Studies have shown that there's basically two types of navigators. There's creatures of habit who need definite directions or have to take a route to understand its relationship to other places, whereas cognitive mappers, the second type, are those who naturally just are explorers. They can find new paths, shortcuts, and unfortunately I am the first, for sure. So how do we process spatial information on a more human level? We piece together our environment like a quilt of memories. For example, Jane Doe, whoever it may be, had her first espresso in Italy. She was at a small cafe in the train station in Florence. So when she recalls that specific memory, it's associated with that specific zone of Florence in her mind. And Blob Maps. So we've arrived at the point where I decided during my research to try my first Blob Map experiment. How could we better understand and get feedback of our illogical organization of space? So what is a Blob Map? Clay, starting with clay, is the material that I used. I realized it's a valuable form of non-lingual communication. It's used in various therapies and programs. So using that, your hands, and steering clear from all the issues I noted in traditional mapping, I drew an extremely minimal map of Florence with basic landmarks for just orientation purposes. And the clay blobs are my interpretation of what parts of Florence are familiar and significant to me. And later on, I took the clay forms I made by hand and applied them to a virtual reality realm to see what they would look like if you could experience a blob in real life. So after getting the participants to create blob maps, I began to analyze the maps more deeply, starting with where we blob. What is the significance of the location that you choose? It could be anywhere. You could choose to blob absolutely anywhere that you would like. So starting with what is the connection of familiarity to the place that you blob? I saw, based on the observation of other people blobbing, creating blob maps, familiarity played a role in how confident participants were in forming blobs. The participant on the right created a blob map of a place he's never been before physically. And it resulted in less contact and less deliberation in the actual blob formation. And it's fair to assume that our overall impression and understanding of highly familiar places is much more complex compared to other places that you're not so familiar with. So is there a time frame or a level of comfortability that must be reached before calling a place other than your hometown home? And what would that behavioral map look like? Also, does our reason for being somewhere affect blob maps? Affect how you see that place in your head? Someone traveling for a short business trip may not have the same perception of a place as someone traveling for a short vacation. Participants, Daniel and Martin, they used their habitual holiday destination in Italy, which Martin describes as his escape place. So that's going to look much different than his hometown or somewhere he goes for work. And what exactly did participants include in their actual clay blobs within a place? From what I observed, people repeatedly depicted significant places, people, sensations, and city structure. Sensations, for example, included an overall feeling towards a place, which my favorite is this giant sunshine. That was participant Daniela's blob from her vacation place. And it just depicts an overall sensation of feeling and attitude towards that place. And also, what is a significant place? So is it purely based on frequency of visitation, or is there something else? What makes a place stick in your memory? And I compared my physical blob map with my iPhone's significant locations based on Florence. This was the outcome. They are actually more similar than I had expected. And then next, I wanted to understand how we blob, how we use our hands. What are the techniques? What did I see from other people, also from my own observations of my blob maps? Where do we begin? Is there a pattern among participants? Interestingly, not everyone used expected colors such as blue for water or green for trees. Color took on a totally different meaning for some, such as white representing a bank in this blob map because it's cold, sterile, institutional. It was not anything that I had expected. And then shape, dimension, touch were all variant as well across participants. Some participants were very intent on being accurate with the place and blob relativity, while others used size or ratio to denote importance. And lastly, what is a blob's relation to time? Our experiences and use of a place may change over time, so how might that affect our understanding of that place? Participant Camilla, her blob map of her native hometown was organized into past, present, and future blobs. Whereas this blob map, Martin's blob map of the vacation spot, included himself and his wife, but with the comprehension that he's not presently physically in that place. So his blob map was essentially a moment or a memory in blob form, like a snapshot. And then the future of blobs. How could blob maps be used in the future? What could we learn from them? What is so great about this strange clay blob that you could depict your space with? And firstly, tactile communication proved to be invaluable. Traditional feedback tools such as written surveys, they just won't elicit the same quality of information as something like a blob map would. And then going back to this cognitive behavioral shift, traditional cognitive-based mapping doesn't currently take into account our subjective interpretation of the physical world. So what we might call illogical, but maybe that's just because we haven't found an explanation for it yet. It's something to explore. Blob mapping opens up the discussion of how and why instead of where we navigate. Also, reimagining space. Blobs will allow us to examine space without the influence of restrictions of walls, obstructions, floor levels, accessibility. Additionally, there's more densely populated areas that can't eternally grow horizontally. At some point, we have to consider vertical. We're going to start going up. So how are we going to map and organize cities that start growing in the vertical direction? And a better understanding of space, I wanted to take it a step further after I made these clay blobs and take those forms and visualize them in space through our phones, laptops, AR goggles, see what could be possible. And especially augmented reality offers the opportunity to carry our blob maps with us in our pockets. We can look at them on our phone or use AR to see them in real time and understand our mental map from a different perspective. So this is my yellow current home blob that I created in my first blob map. And then I reimagined it in AR. I modeled it in an AR program, applied the color, used the same dimensions, respective to how I made it on the map. And it's the entirety of basically the stadium over in Florence. And yeah, those are blob maps. So also, if you guys are interested, there's the Blob Map website, which will be up and running soon. And you're welcome to explore it. It's blobmaps.com. There'll be more information sent out. And you can even make a blob map yourself. That would be fantastic to see other places and get more feedback. So that's it for now. I'll come back.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Really fascinating. I just remind the participants that there is a question and answer button at the bottom right if you want to ask any questions. But I do have a first question for Bridget, and this is, I understand it's more of a psychological than a design question, but really, what did you understand of yourself and others people exploration of space? What was really new through this research?
The first, I thought it was really interesting, my own blob map first, just based on my experience and everyone else, it's totally different. Okay, looking at a presentation of a blob map, but then doing it yourself, it's almost like a self-therapy of understanding space because you're communicating in a way without words. So I think that was really valuable because I was able to understand how I organize Florence. I did my first blob map of Florence, and I'm not from Florence. I've been here for long enough that I kind of understand the city, but it's not my hometown. So it was really interesting to see what parts of it that I use and what parts that I have no idea why I blobbed some parts. And I wanted to understand why that was significant or why I included that. And then further, it was even more interesting. I kind of assumed that everyone's map would be the same of Florence that I asked, especially other expats or other Americans living here. And everyone's map was just like incredibly different, so different. And that was the beautiful part of it, because it's definitely, at that point, it's a feedback tool. You can understand that it's not just a fun coloring book with lines and whatnot. You're actually gaining something from it.
Yeah, I actually have another question, which I'm going to read live. Would there be a connection for people to run into each other on vacation in a certain space without ever communicating they would go to that place, or are even on vacation in the same town? Do spaces attract certain personalities?
Let's see, do spaces. So a preface of everything that I've gotten from Blob Maps. I'm not a psychologist, but it's actually, I think it could be a really great tool also in the field of psychology, architecture, for urban planning, anything in that realm. So using Blob Maps, it would be interesting to get feedback from professionals in those fields and see how they interpret these maps and how they think maybe it is certain personalities, or maybe it is it has something to do with, like we talked about, familiarity, or where your hometown is, your culture, and why you find places attractive, or why you're drawn towards certain places or repulsed by certain places. No, it's immensely interesting. I think it's definitely got room for more work, more research to be done.
We have another question that is, have you thought about trying blob maps in internal places like the Mercato Centrale?
I have. I've thought about, so this started as a wayfinding project, and wayfinding is, there's internal, external places, more or less. And there's wayfinding for cities, but then also for airports, schools, Mercato Centrale, there's all these internal complex places that you have to get point A to point B. I chose to focus on cities because of the complexity of the people using it. So it's not, if you go to a hospital, people generally have a very similar end goal in motivation. So wayfinding is very important, especially if you have to find the emergency ward. That's has to be very clear. But with the city, people are using it for so many different reasons, and they're experiencing the space so differently. So, but it would be really interesting also to get feedback even between employees to see how it changes within an internal place, how differently
the feeling of the internal place. And a next question, how do you save your blob map once you create it, and can you add to it later?
So Blob Map, I have instructions that I've put together. It's more or less, it's best if you destroy it after. I really do think it's not supposed to be a work of art. I think the best blob map would be something that's completely unconscious, subconscious, without thinking about it. So you don't want to spend too much time on it. It's not supposed to be something that you're framing and putting on your wall. It's really just purging anything that's in your mental map onto paper. And then after, you can take a photo of it and you can explain and write down. But yeah, a photo is the best way. And then there's also a Blob Map explanation sheet where you can write in detail what each blob means, or if you had anything you wanted to describe it further. And adding to it later, I don't think you should add to it later, but I think coming back and creating blob maps in the future would be really interesting, because like Camilla, your blob map, you had childhood, past and present, basically, of your hometown, your native town in Florence. And it's changed, which I think is normal. When we grow and we gain new experiences, we're going to have a different interpretation of space. So it would be interesting to come back and do another blob map, maybe in a year or something.
Layers, yes, yeah. One on top of the other.
Exactly.
And another question, do you envision that a blob map becomes a tool for communicating something, so that you could do your blob and maybe share it with somebody else?
I think so. I was personally, when I did the AR blob, so I was walking around the stadium and there's this giant yellow blob above me, and I was in absolute bliss. That was such a fun moment, because it's something you make by hand and it's got meaning for you already in that way. And then I modeled it and I could walk around, and it was just really cool. And I thought, how interesting would it be if I could see other people's blobs or experience, their interpretation of that space, or if there was another blob in that area, why? Like, what is that area for them? What does it mean? And who are they? How long have they been there? What's their, what is it about them? And it could almost be a connection tool too. It'd be really interesting. Yeah.
And back on your research work, which was very deep, what is some designer of the past or some approach of the past to mapping that has impressed you especially?
Approach to mapping the past. So I did a lot of research on the history of maps. And I don't know if this directly answers your question, but something I found really inspirational was how diverse we've been in understanding and mapping basically our environment. So like the song lines in Australia, the Aboriginal people in Australia used to use song lines. So an auditory way of understanding space and navigating. And that was the initial part of my research. I started thinking, we're very heavily visual, and we have, the phone, our attention is pulled down, but there are just so many different ways of experiencing and then communicating space. And tactile, that's the first way of us communicating when we're infants, is we use our hands, we touch everything. So for us to be able to communicate, to depict something by modeling it, especially depicting a place that you've experienced by foot, it was an interesting
nice connection.
Circle, yeah.
Yeah, full circle. So there is many more questions. Through your experience of using blobs to mark spaces, how do you see Blob Map providing a visual or iconic language that people can use to share experiences of spaces and places? Yes, this is something that you have sort of answered already. Have you thought about the values this could provide and the ways it could be used to understand experiences of a location, a city, based on gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomics, etc.?
Absolutely. I think it would be, it would require data. It would require a lot of blob mapping or whatever it may be. But if you had a more broad image of how people feel about a place, not just asking, what is your age? What is your ethnicity? What do you do for work? And then putting that into a database, but understanding more from their point of view, if they're able to communicate versus just filling out a form, it would be much more, it would just be a broader image.
Speaking of this, we have another question that is, how do you feel your background in psychology affected how you interpreted each person's blob map?
This whole project, I feel like, kind of turned into a psychology project, which is fantastic, and I love it. I mean, my first degree is in psychology, so that's always fun to apply. I remember I was really interested in abnormal psychology, but the funny thing is, the first day of my abnormal psychology class is, what is abnormal psychology? We're all abnormal. There's no normal psychology. So bringing that mentality into this project of, we're all very individual, and it's important not to consider that we're all experiencing or interacting the same. You know, when you say hi to someone on the street, it's going to be a very different experience for them versus you don't know. Definitely cultures too clashing. I've learned a lot from being an American in Italy, and I'm trying to get used to it, but it's beautiful in some way too. It's we're all very, very different. So
yeah, I heard you have been giving a course in the difference between and
yes.
Which is pretty hard for Italians.
True, yeah.
And a last interesting question related to the future. Have you thought about how you will carry on with this work? As you have said, it has so many applications in different fields.
Carrying on with the work, because it's got so many different applications, it's almost, I don't even know where I would start, because there's so many different fields that it could help. Especially, I'm thinking, I really looked into urban planning, architecture. You know, people are constantly looking for feedback about a city and how they use it and what they thought. And you think about going to even an airport and they have those stands with the happy to sad faces. How was your experience? People slapped the sad face or whatever it may be. But a better understanding of how we feel about a place definitely helps with future development and growth, specifically for cities. So, but it would be also interesting looking at internal places, like the question before, Centrale, we could see.
Definitely.
It would help a lot, yeah.
Well, we have only 1 minute to go, and I'll go with the last question, which is, can you imagine expanding the possibility to name the different blobs to address the various qualities of the experiences of that they represent?
Names to name the experience, name the different blobs to address
name the different blobs.
So we actually started with trying to make this into an app, and it got to the point where it was like, add a feeling for this blob. So it was a happy place, a sad place, a feeling, or a place of fear. And it brought me back to one of the initial concerns that I had with traditional mapping, was the iconography and segmenting feelings or whatever it may be into strict compartments. So it would be interesting to somehow create a connection if you could understand that this blob or this person is somehow connected to you, but without keeping it within these rigid,
I also remember in the beginning you had the idea of a slider and maybe a color slider between people that stay in a place for 3 days versus people that stay a lifetime. So there is a whole range in between.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Bridget. This is really a fascinating project. And thank you for everybody that participated. I hope you enjoyed it. And as we said, you will find this recording on the SACI website in a couple of days. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Ciao, thank you.